Hello team, and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce, and my guest, Jonathan. Two Jonathans for the price of one, which is fabulous. I haven't done too much shouting about this because it's all been a bit last minute and it's been a really crazy day, so apologies, but it will be shouted about afterwards, so even if you're not here live, you'll be here eventually. I know you will. Thank you. I'm really happy to be joined by Jonathan, who does a lot of work. I don't know if he's like one of the founder members of it. I'm sure he can explain. For Tochnyi, who are Tochnyi, well, I appeared for a very kind invitation from them on Tochnyi recently to talk about drones and kind of philosophy and disinformation and whatnot. And that was really cool. I really appreciated being on the where was it, the drone army one over there, and they kindly allowed me to mirror that on my channel, so thanks to them for that. A great bunch of people, some amazing minds there, and also really interested and driven by the desire for accurate information dissemination and fighting against disinformation and misinformation. So that's what Tochnyi are. I will leave Jonathan to introduce himself and the kind of project that is Tochnyi. So just to let you know, tonight we are going to be speaking about culture, Ukrainian culture, and the attack on culture, both kind of direct and explicit and also indirect as a result of the war that the Russians have brought upon Ukraine. But anyway, that's enough of me waffling on. Thank you, Jonathan, for joining us. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you. Hello. Yes, I'm Jonathan. I am from the Tochnyi group. Thank you very much indeed for having me on today. At Tochnyi, like you said, yeah, I am one of the founder members, but we are all a collective of some extraordinary people from a diverse range across society. We collaborate with a wide range of people with the aim of accurately reporting information relating to the Russian invasion of Ukraine 2014 to the present day. My background is in education, particularly history, English, music. What really got me into, I think the points where I became particularly interested in Ukraine was when I was working with Ukrainians back in 2014 who had left Ukraine via the Sergei Prokofiev airport in Donetsk. And that invasion seemed to play out in my office on their phone screens as they witnessed and translated for me the events of that first invasion of Ukraine by Russia. I later heard or read stories of young men being called up. I saw the videos of those fiercely determined young Ukrainians who defied their occupiers by going onto the streets and cities and towns in the Donbass, bearing their Ukrainian flag and bearing the brunt of Russian malice towards them. So, these acts of defiance, which, against a country which have had quite clearly since Ukraine's independence in 1991, enviously drawn its plans against them, as H.G. Wells might put it. During this period, I learnt about the Ukrainian character and its defiance and its spirit, but I also learned a considerable amount about the influence that Russian disinformation had on media in your country, Jonathan, and in the UK and abroad. So the reality I heard, witnessed, was absolutely different to what media in our country and abroad was printing at the time. So I became really interested in the topic of mis and disinformation, how it is disseminated, and committed to correcting this when I encounter it.
Interesting. Yeah, no, it is. I was thinking about this today, actually, Jonathan. I was thinking, because I get these moments where I suddenly get really quite freaked out by how challenging disinformation really is. And when I think about elections, I tell you when I had that moment, it's when I read earlier on today that Ursula von der Leyen might have trouble getting re-elected as in charge of the European Union because of the rise of the far right in the EU. And then I was thinking how much that Russia will be driving that project to oust her, that will be amplifying all the messages from the far right, which have been growing. And I've written articles on this recently about how the Russians are being incredibly divisive in those information campaigns. And it's just the return on investment they get from disinformation campaigns is scarily good, and it's relatively easy for them to do. And it is actually genuinely freaking me out at the moment. I get a real sense of existential vulnerability in terms of what we take for granted in terms of our political structures and our freedoms and our liberties. This is why people don't get it quite often when I talk to them about how freaking important this war in Ukraine is, because on the back of it is all this attack on our information spaces that is existentially threatening. Anyway, sorry, I'm liable to go off on one, but that's how I feel about that.
No, that's it's very important. You're absolutely right. And these narratives that Russia pushes are, I think they're easier to spot these days. We can identify them. Yeah.
Can everyone?
I think it involves talking to as wide a range of people as possible. It can be difficult to be that person in the workplace who's bringing up Ukraine a lot, or whatever community group you join, and you bring up the topic of Ukraine. I think these topics can be stimulated by things like wearing a Ukrainian lapel pin or a Ukrainian wristband, and actually, when people kind of know that Ukraine is going to be a topic on the agenda, they might either kind of avoid it, or they might be really quite interested and engaged by it. I actually have I have encountered people who return with the same question, which means that they're thinking quite intensely about it. But I mean, I think we've also got to compare the way that Russian disinformation functioned in 2014, its effectiveness then and now. So the attacks on Western discourse by the Internet Research Agency of St. Petersburg, this was admittedly quite effective at that time in influencing discourse in terms of comments under newspaper articles, and the discourse, the kind of statements that you would hear politicians make. Their potency, the Internet Research Agency's potency, Russia's potency has diminished. We all relish in this diminishment, and it's not impotency, but comparable to 2014. It is in a form of impotency in some places where it used to flourish.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and I love this. I love that, Jonathan, that this is nothing that we are particularly going to talk about, but we seem to have gone down this rabbit hole, and it's so important. I don't know that I agree with you. I think in some ways it has diminished, but I've been looking a little bit recently at what's going on with the Houthis. I'm having this ongoing argument as to whether the US strikes on the Houthis is constitutional or not, and it's a really interesting debate about actually whether it's war, whether it's piracy. Anti-piracy is what they're doing, and I align with more the idea that it's anti-piracy. Anyway, that's irrelevant. What I've been looking at is the sorts of people who are amplifying messages against the US and for Yemen, for the Yemenis, like people that otherwise wouldn't have given a toss about this. But it's your Jackson Hinkles, it's your all the same voices that are shouting about this, that are also your pro-Kremlin voices. And it may be a new context, a new area, but it's connected and it's divisive. And when you see these people at the gates of the White House trying to break the fence down and shouting about what's happened with the Houthis and shout about Yemen on the back of Palestine and Gaza, which I think is an interesting and very important topic. And I'm pro-Palestine, but I'm not pro-Hamas. But I see these divisive voices that are as amplified now and as amplifying now as I think they've ever been.
Yes, I'd agree with some of that, certainly. I think one of the comments that's in the chat about the insidious nature of creeping narratives within the discourse, it's still present to this day. So, one of the ones that I've heard is, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is actually complicated. It's quite complicated over there, and of course it isn't. It is the least complicated war to understand in generations.
I think so. I'd agree. Yeah.
It is Ukraine is fighting, defending its territory. When it strikes Russian military targets, it does so with accuracy and it ascribes to the standards of NATO armed forces, and it has done this by really coming from a base where there was a heavy Soviet influence, which is completely understandable given that it only finally achieved its independence in 1991, and it's how it has gone from being a peripheral territory of the Russian Empire to establishing itself as a 21st century Ukraine is remarkable, and those achievements shouldn't be overlooked.
Well, I think that's an absolutely fantastic segue into actually our topic there, which is establishing itself as a country in its own rights. Because, it would only have been 20 years ago when I would have been calling it the Ukraine. In fact, I saw someone just the other day post an absolutely lovely thing on Twitter. She's a teacher, I think, from Wales, who has a couple of students who are working in her class who have come over as refugees from Ukraine, and they've not only learned and exceeded in English, but they've learned and exceeded in Welsh as well. And she put this lovely thing up on Twitter, extolling the virtues of the work ethic of these kids, and then put, who have come over from the Ukraine. And of course, she was called out by a bunch of people. She said, I know, I've got it wrong, and I can't edit Twitter, so she couldn't edit it. But everyone was piling on saying it's not Ukraine, it's not the Ukraine, it's Ukraine. But it's the country of Ukraine has moved into people's consciousnesses in such a way that shows it's an absolute own goal for Putin, who wanted to eradicate the identity. But here it is, we have more cognizance of the identity and culture of Ukraine than we ever would have had Putin not invaded. So that's I think a good place for you to introduce what you're going to talk about in terms of the culture and identity of Ukraine and the threat that Russia poses and has posed to it.
Yes. So I just on that note, the ambassadors from this particular country, Ukraine, have been remarkable ambassadors. And both in life and the ones that we're going to look at in terms of what they achieved during their life before their death. So I thought we could start with Yuri Kerpatenko. So Yuri Kerpatenko was he was only 46 at the time of his death, but in the years before his death, he was a pillar of his community. He was a Kherson-born conductor. He studied at the Kiev Conservatory. He had been working at the Kherson Oblast Philharmonic since 2000. He was, perhaps like all musicians are, active in many other groups in his community. He wasn't just content with the big gig at the Kherson Phil, but he was clearly imbuing a high standard of skill, preparation, and performance in musicians across a wide spectrum of the Ukrainian society which he lived and worked with. So he, on a daily basis, inspired people to turn up on perhaps cold winter evenings like this one for a rehearsal, challenging them to produce their best, whatever was happening in their lives. There's a quote actually about orchestras that it's always wrong, that it's no matter what happens, they need to start and finish playing at the right time. I won't swear on your channel, Jonathan, but this is obviously not true. For instruments, this requires things like correct dynamics between accompanying and melodic parts, ensuring that a soloist can be heard, ensuring that the silencers are there. For a choral group, it requires things like the sounds that are, in particular, they resonate within certain acoustics like big halls or churches, those sibilant sounds. that everyone stops making those sounds at precisely the right time. Conductors are really very important. But yeah, Kerpatenko did a lot of this day in, day out in the city of Kherson and beyond. He was principal conductor at the Mykola Kulesh Music and Drama Theatre, and he was also the principal conductor of the Hileia Chamber Orchestra, also in Kherson. And this is the orchestra which was specifically instructed by the Russian occupying forces on the 1st of October 2022 to perform a concert as a means of normalizing the Russian presence in Kherson and to normalize its crimes in Kherson, and by extension elsewhere in occupied Ukraine. This was going to be a propaganda piece. The Russians were going to film this and they were going to show it in Russia and use it as an example of look how content life is, the people of Kherson are under Russian occupation. So for me, there's one of my favorite people in the piano world is the Argentinian pianist Martha Argerich. She once said, "Audiences are not important for me now, and they never were." And I've always interpreted this as not the literal sense of don't bother turning up to hear live music, because the opposite is true. Audiences for live music have never been more important, whatever the concert is. I interpret this to mean that when it comes to the thing that musicians and conductors strive to create, that thing that is more important, it has greater significance than the audience's mere presence. So this is about the values rooted in producing output of the highest standard possible, and most definitely not mediocrity. So there was that Times article published after Kerpatenko's death. I was reading it this morning for breakfast. I couldn't read all of it because I don't have a Times subscription. But the title was he martyred for his music? ? And I think for me, Kerpatenko was martyred for his principles. He was offered the chance to live at the expense of participating in a pretense, a confidence trick, not only on the residents of Kherson, who knew only too well the realities of living under Russian occupation, but the confidence trick that Russia plays on the wider world using the weaponization of music and culture. It's a weapon wielded by its cultural ambassadors, be they alive or dead. Time and again, people in musical communities, I think, across the West are confronted with this question of how to approach the performance of Russian composers' music against the backdrop of both Russian war crimes and a war itself of a scale not seen in Europe since 1945. So music has been weaponized by Russia in our countries, and I firmly believe that this was part of the Kremlin's equation before the 2022 full-scale invasion. There's a massacre in Bucha. Listen to one of the peaks at Rachmaninoff's piano concerto. The entire city of Mariupol has been ravaged and leveled by Russians. Don't reject the inclusion of any Russian singer or conductor due to the actions of Russians in Ukraine. We are expected, to see these two things as distinct, which completely ignores the fact that Russian music and arts has been and continues to be weaponized at the cost of more war and more war crimes and continued suffering. And Yuri Kerpatenko paid the ultimate price for this.
So what was it that he did I guess so heroically?
So he was given a choice. There's that quote about colonialism. It deprives you of your confidence, and to get it back, you have to fight to redress the balance. Well, classical musicians aren't known for fighting. There have been examples of. There was the Polish pianist Christian Zimmerman, who has always been notably outspoken over politics. he's kind of remarkable, actually, because he's got the most acclaimed recordings of Chopin's works and Liszt's diabolically difficult piano sonata. Musicians like this have a choice, perhaps, to not say anything. Kerpatenko chose not to. Musicians in a war zone, I mean, if they're given a chance of survival, if they carry on performing or conducting when the occupying force tells them to do, they have a choice not to speak out. So Kerpatenko was offered on the 1st of October the chance of life at the expense of his integrity. And he chose his integrity.
Wow. So simple as that. Yeah. And what's interesting, whenever I hear about these incredible stories of people who literally sacrifice their lives for their ideologies, for their beliefs, for their moral convictions, I always think, would I be strong enough to do that? Would I have made that same? I believe the same thing as him, and I can easily sit here and say, yeah, I would do the same. But would I have the absolute courage in my conviction to do that? And I don't know. I can't know until I'm in that situation. But here is someone who truly did do that.
Yes, and resistance, as we know, takes many forms. And what's interesting, perhaps, about classical music is it has a track record of pacifying people, and the Russians are fully aware of this, obviously, with their their reoccurring Swan Lake TV appearances. But this has been actually proven. There was something I was reading yesterday about pacifying people with classical music. I found this Transport for London once utilized classical music in London underground stations. Basically, they had a trial period at Elm Park Station in 2003. And this was a trial that had also occurred at one of my ancestral regions up at Tyne and Wear's metro station, which is basically why I thought I'd mention it. But yeah, basically Transport for London initiated a broadcast of lots of classical music, and it had the following results. During the 18-month trial period, it was reported that there was a 33% reduction in robberies, a 25% decrease in assaults on staff, a 37% decline in vandalism, and the Underground's playlist spanned 40 hours. And in case you're wondering, it include works by Handel, Beethoven, Schubert, Vivaldi, Prokofiev, and the great Hungarian composer Franz Liszt. So,
did they not continue doing that? Did they, that's a nice time period. Turns out it's perfect. Everyone's lovely. Anyway, we're stopping that now.
Yeah, it's that's a good question. I'd like to know why not.
But yeah, so here we had this chap refusing to go and perform, on the behest of the Russians. And what do you know? Did they just go to his home? In fact, I think it says it here. Yeah, in his own home for refusing to participate. So they obviously went to his home and basically executed him.
Yes, they turned up at his home, and he was shot. Now, deaths within occupied Ukraine at the hands of the Russian forces, as we saw with cases such as Nikita and Tigran and Berdyansk last year, getting things like a coroner's report from these deaths is notably difficult. But when it is confirmed by both the Russians and the Ukrainians, we know this to be true. They turned up at his home and they shot him. And they shot him for a simple act of refusing to comply with the Russian authorities' demands and to acquiesce to crimes so egregious within the modern world and Europe in the 21st century, and acquiesce to that instead of taking action. And Kerpatenko chose action. He may have just said, no, I'm not doing this. He may have, but we do also know he was publicly outspoken, which was a very brave thing to do. He was, there were in a couple of news articles on Ukrainian media, his public social media statements were noted. And I think that these actions speak to a choice that we also have in the West. I think concert halls and venues of the Western world, its musical directors especially, owe a similar type of action to Ukraine in recognition of the fact that its people daily give their lives and limbs and other things fundamental to the creation of art, like their hearing, in the cause of greater European security and greater world security. You know, how many Ukrainian musicians have lost their hearing during this war and will never play again? How many artists generally have lost a hand? You know, we won't know this until after the war has ended. So, but I think that they deserve, at the very least, our recognition of their sacrifice.
Yeah, and there's an interesting quote here in the Newsweek article. "I've seen too much silence from Russian colleagues," she added. I don't know if that's his wife. Number of artists, music conductor is another conductor. History of Russia imposing a comply or die policy against artists is nothing new. It has a history which spans for hundreds of years. We'll come back to that in a second. "I've seen too much silence from Russian colleagues," she added. "Would this be the time for Russian musicians, especially those living and working abroad, to finally step up and take a stand against the Russian regime's actions in Ukraine?" she asks. And you were actually talking to me before we came live about a Russian pianist who has done pretty much the opposite of that and kind of acquiesced to the as you say, to the Russian kind of narrative in and I think I reported on her much earlier on in the war, where she was doing these kind of little snippets that you saw on the socials from news pieces where she was like speaking in Mariupol and you know, talking about the wonderful, you know, Russian motherland and whatnot. So unfortunately, I don't know that certainly in that case Russian musicians have come to the aid, but I don't know in more general terms what the Russian cultural scene has done.
It has the Russian cultural scene has, as it did with Stalin's repressions during the 1930s, that I know we're going to move on to soon, sought to erase Ukrainian cultural and artistic heritage and identity and replace it with a Russian one, which is Kremlin sanctioned and authorized. And this has been this, you know, we've seen concerts from the ruins of Mariupol by Kremlin musical propagandists, I would call them, people who once had a career in the West and thankfully do not do anymore. They did back in 2014. In the case of some of them, they no longer have, due to their actions online and offline.
Yeah, and there are so many people, unfortunately, so many people. I was talking about this last week, where two poets sadly died last week, I think, on the front lines, pretty much within 24 hours of each other, I believe. You got here in this Kiev Independent article, you've got Yuri Kerpatenko that you've just talked about. There are others. I mean, there are so many more. Victor Onisko, a film editor. You have Lyubov Panchenko, an artist and fashion designer. You've got Alexander Shapoval, an ex-soloist of Ukraine's National Opera and Ballet Theatre. Ola Pavlenko, artist and researcher of Ukrainian cuisine. So many different aspects of culture that you can go to see how much this war has cost Ukraine in terms of their cultural heritage. And of course, it's not just people, it's places. There are museums talking about Kherson. The museum in Kherson was famously ransacked and they nicked a bunch of stuff to take back. The zoo in Kherson. So many places, artifacts that have been lost forever, buildings that have been destroyed or damaged, the theatres, I mean, goodness me, there'll be stories told about the theatre in Mariupol where they were housing, 600 people, and that was destroyed as it was housing those children underneath. And all these cultural landmarks, as well as people being lost forever, is a real tragedy for Ukrainian culture.
Yeah, the flower of Ukrainian youth, a flower of Ukrainian youth, and flowers plural, have been felled. They will become a garden, but it is impossible to ignore the fact that they have been felled and that their loss is felt. And it's perhaps we are drawn to finishing such kind of conclusions and observations about this war to finish with something positive. But it is, when we look at the lives of the people that you just illustrated on your screen, these people had a profound their development as artists, the amount of work that they put in to their craft was significant, persistent. And I think Ukrainian persistence in its culture and in the way that it functions as a nation defending itself, and as has been noted on some of your other shows, in terms of the way that it approaches its defense in terms of military adaptation, this persistence is remarkable. One of the other impacts, of course, of this destruction of Ukrainian heritage has been in events like the dam collapse in Novokakhovka. So this was remarkable because the artist Paulina Reiko's house was lost forever. And I thought I'd illustrate this. I've just put this into the back channel. If you can see this.
Yep. I'll grab that up.
So this particular house was it was a symbol of Ukraine's resistance following the 2022 invasion. When the floodwaters breached the Novokakhovka Dam, this particular museum was unfortunately lost forever. We do have photographs of these things, you know, and we perhaps need to put this into a wider perspective of the kind of artworks and documentation which you know serve as primary source evidence in terms of historical research, that a lot of that stuff was lost in the past, and that was unique too. But at the same time, we are left with this inescapable thought of this should not and could not, it should not have been allowed to happen. It was the decision to launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the decisions made prior by Western leaders to not arm Ukraine adequately. These are like the breath of kings, you know, one word and something changes. It's like that line from Richard II, yeah, how long a time lies in one little word, 4 lagging winters and 4 wanton springs end in a word such as the breath of kings. So whether it's ATACMS to Ukraine, whether it's Ukraine having an air force which can sufficiently match the Russians in the air, whether it's supplying them with enough weapon systems before 2022, these decisions were they were possible. They were, you know, the breath of kings would have allowed, in, you know, not in a literal sense, but the right policy choices would have saved a great many lives, would have saved a great many things of heritage and importance to millions of people. We can but look forward.
I just want to, and I know I shouldn't derail conversations as rich as this by referring to what can only be described as a troll, but I just find this an interesting point. I just want to dwell on this a second. Stop acting like you really care about Ukraine. There are many countries which experienced the same fate but did not hear the word from you. Right. I wonder if people like this would go to somebody who's just done a PhD on Schubert, right, and said, stop talking about Schubert. Stop concentrating only on Schubert. Why don't you go and talk about all these other composers? Why only one? As if like there is some, you were doing some wrong in focusing anywhere in the world on anything particular. If you've done a PhD or have a channel that's dedicated to insects. It's like, why are you only looking at insects and not other forms of animal life? Like, why would you do that? And yes, this has a moral dimension, Ukraine, and there are many other conflicts that have a moral dimension. I could focus equally on Israel, Palestine. In fact, I have done a playlist on my other channel on that, and I do mention it. But I only have so much time and so much bandwidth in my own brain to focus on every conflict and every problem in the world would be exhausting and prohibitively time consuming. And so therefore, I am concentrating on this. partly because I find it that important, or no, largely, in fact, almost entirely because I find it that important and that morally clear that this conflict, and here we're talking about the cultural dimension to it, but this conflict is so important to us all, as I mentioned in terms of disinformation earlier, that it requires this much attention, because this is an inflection point, I think, in history at the moment, and it is geographically focused on this part of the world. And so that's my answer to that ridiculous comment by that, I'm sorry, what can only be described as a troll. Anyway, I thought I'd say
sorry,
that.
I have a response to that.
Please do. Let's go for it.
We also have a choice. We can either we can either reside in mediocrity and think that that is perfectly acceptable to us, or we can value the extraordinary. And that is what this focus on Ukrainians, wherever we meet them, be they ambassadors, refugees from abroad that we meet in our own countries, or we meet them through their work or the legacy of their work after their death. This is the extraordinary. This deserves to be noted, highlighted, and these stories, they warrant being passed on to a greater number of ears.
Excellent. Well said. Well, so if we get back to, before I come on to looking at the historical aspect, one of the questions I wanted to ask you is this approach of the Russians in terms of, is this degradation of Ukrainian culture a result of an explicit project by the Russians, or is this just part and parcel of war?
I think the evidence clearly shows that this, since 2014, has, going back hundreds of years, has been an attempt to starve Ukraine of any cultural identity, to suppress it when it does flourish. And yes, the article that you bring up here is a good one. Upon the death of Victoria Amelina, this was something which she won the Joseph Conrad Prize, and
what's that for?
It was for her. It was, I can't.
As in, what's the prize? Is it an artistic prize?
Oh yes, Joseph Conrad was the writer of Heart of Darkness. He was a Polish-British author. There's this unforgettable sentence actually about the old river and its broad reach. It's like the old river in its broad reach rested unruffled at the decline of day, after ages of good service done to the people of its banks, and it extends to the uppermost ends of the earth. And these Ukrainians, I feel like are kind of reflected in the Joseph Conrad Heart of Darkness novel, because they are forever young. They had and continue to have a broad reach. They are, through their death and their life's work following their death, immortalized by their ages of good service done in this righteous cause, both in their work and in their sacrifice, be it in the work that they did before their life, or in terms of the work they did defending their country, despite the challenges that they faced. I can't even begin to imagine what it was like for any citizen soldier to be taken out of a civilian environment and be posted to the front line. We can only imagine what it's like for somebody who perhaps has lacked military training, has spent their entire life as these athletes and these people that were noted in the Key of Independent article earlier, did their works and stories reach to the uppermost ends of the earth.
It's interesting you mention athletes as well, because of course it's every. I mean, we are picking on culture here, but we could talk about I don't know, the science in terms of Ukrainian science and how that's been affected. We could talk about metallurgy. We could talk about design. We could talk about engineering. We could talk about sport, as you say, with the athletes that have died, perished, as a result of this war. We are picking on culture because it's important for identity of Ukraine, but there are all these other aspects, of course, that are important for Ukraine and Ukrainian society. Victoria Amelina is an interesting one. I don't know if you remember, viewers, in Kramatorsk, there's this pizza restaurant that was hit. There are a number of people in there, I believe some Colombian journalists as well, who were injured as a result. She was very sadly, her life was taken away, and lots of people paid, great reverence to her after she died, and she seemed to be a very, very well respected icon. She was a novelist, but also working as a war crimes investigator, and then sadly died. And another one of these important cultural figures who passed away as a result of the war in a very direct way. A bomb landing or a missile landing in a pizzeria in Kramatorsk, and she's no longer with us.
Yeah, and people like Amelina, Jonathan, they chose to stand out. They didn't, the Yuri Kerpatenkos, the Victoria Amelinas, some Timothy Snyder got his book here on 20 lessons from the Ukrainian century on tyranny. He says,
so good. The on tyranny is brilliant.
Great,
and the sorry, I'm interrupting you, but the audiobook part of the Ukrainian bit is simply brilliant. Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, there's after he says, stand out. Someone has to. It is easy in words and deeds to follow along. It can feel strange to do or say something different, but without that unease, there is no freedom. So in order to stand out, you've got to experience that that you've got to question what you're doing. So for Kerpatenko living under occupation, for Amelina being under constant threat of attack, it can't have been easy knowing that she was a potential target of the Russian army that had invaded her country. But as Snyder says, without this feeling of unease, without this constant doubt, there is no freedom. It's very easy to follow others. It's very difficult to make a stand and say, I'm going to choose this direction. I know this to be right. This is a righteous moral cause. And like Snyder says, the moment you set an example, the spell of the status quo is broken and others will follow. So even though Amelina's death was a traumatic event for all who knew her, she has inspired a whole generation of Ukrainian writers and allies of Ukraine who have been inspired by her work.
And this is where it gets to, I mean, this article talks about this idea of being a very purposeful project by the Russians, harking back, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, or sometimes it rhymes pretty bloody well, so as to look a bit like repeating. She told me about her fellow writer, Volodymyr Vakulenko, who had been disappeared by the Russian occupiers, and how she had dug up the diary he buried beneath the cherry saplings in his garden. And she told me how when Kiev was encircled and bombs were raining down on Kharkiv, when she wasn't sure how many of her writer friends would survive, she had thought a great deal about the executed Renaissance. I'd never heard that phrase before, but as I met more Ukrainian cultural figures, I soon would, repeatedly. It refers to a generation of modernist novelists, poets, essayists, playwrights, and directors working in the 1920s, mostly in the eastern city of Kharkiv, then the capital of Soviet Ukraine. Under the Leninist policy of Ukrainization, they initially flourished. They were even housed in their own elegant apartment block in Kharkiv called Slovo House, Word House. But under Stalin's enforcement of the homogeneous Moscow-centric Soviet culture, they were arrested in the early 1930s and killed, hundreds of them, in the Great Purge of 1937. Their works were officially obliterated from the record, destroyed on printing presses in some cases. Much has been lost. What survived did so through the efforts of a few exiled keepers of the flame. or in archives opened after 1989, or in precious copies of or typescripts concealed through the Soviet years. The tag "Executed Renaissance" comes from the title of an anthology published by dissidents in Paris in 1959. A plaque outside Slovo House, the building is still standing, despite the scar from a rocket that hit it last spring, records the names of the murdered writers who once lived there, so on and so forth. We get this sense that this really is a very purposeful. Yes, there will be the kind of scare quotes accidental killing of the cultural players and figures in the Ukrainian national scene, but there's also this very deliberate attempt to eradicate the culture of Ukraine, and we can see that in the rhetoric of the Russian propagandists that people like Julia Davis do such a good job of translating as Russian media monitor, and people like Prune60 here is a really great the handle on Twitter that also talks a lot to this and delves into a lot of what Julia Davis translates. We hear consistently rhetoric from propagandists that they are wanting to eradicate the identity, the language, the culture, the people of Ukraine. So this is a very purposeful project by Russia.
Yes, and it's one of the facets of totalitarianism, as Hannah Arendt once said. She said the ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the utterly convinced Nazi or the completely convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, i.e. the reality of experience, and the distinction between true and false, which she calls the standards of thought, no longer exist. So the reason why Russia wants to eradicate Ukrainian culture is, number one, it is threatened by the very existence of Ukrainian culture. It knows that what exists to its in the country of Ukraine is far superior to anything which is currently being produced under the regime of Putin, and this is also, the oppression of Russian dissidents during the communist era also speaks to this. These people could not and were not allowed to flourish under this time. They had to hide their sexuality. They had to hide who they were, their identity, from the authorities, because if they did, this challenged the very nature of it challenged the authoritarian rule itself. So the great pianist Richter, Slavoslav Richter, once he had to basically he spent a lot of his time under oppressive Soviet rule, and people like him survived being sent to gulags, having their hands and bodies half broken by the experience of communist rule. And this is a linear trend to today. This challenges the rule of Putin. The very fact that there is a flourishing Ukraine with an artistic, cultural scene and an identity which is obviously much revered within outside of Ukraine, and I would also suggest by some Russians themselves, who are quite taken by the romantic idea of the Ukrainian Cossack who lives free on the steppes. So yeah, this is a challenge to the authoritarian rule of the core nation of the former Russian Empire and its metropole of Moscow.
There's an interesting question here, and this is a genuine, good faith question from King Raccoon, really good member and supporter of the channel. Why is it important to point out culture? Russia just wants to kill, bomb, kidnap, rape, steal anything that is Ukrainian. I'll have a stab at this first, and if you don't mind, Jonathan, and then let you take over. My answer to this would be that you can kill people, but in a very, and to get unemotional about this, people can reproduce and you get more people. And so, there is that. but if you eradicate a culture, then that is, and fully get rid of it in a way that we've seen this being done in history, then you can't just rebirth a culture like that. Sometimes culture takes like centuries to establish itself. You know, the expertise of those cultural icons isn't just something that you can get back like that. So I think there's something more long term with the idea of eradicated culture. If it's just like you blow up an apartment block and you can rebuild an apartment block, you blow up I don't know, the Statue of Liberty or something like that, and it's slightly different. There is this sense of historic value that you just can't get back. I remember when ISIS, was it ISIS that, or the Taliban, blew up those statues along the cliffs in Afghanistan, and you're thinking, goodness me, they stood for that long, and you'll never get them back. And so the culture is, I think that when you get a loss of culture, is this sense that's a once in a lifetime kind of thing that you can't just replace so easily. What are your thoughts?
Culture identifies us as human beings, and it produces who we are. This does not have to come through free time activities. It comes through our work, whatever it is, and the standards and values that we put into that work. So there's a reason why we're not all raccoons, with respect to King Raccoon. There's a reason why we are human beings with our own foibles, yeah, right, but with our own unique character. So human beings producing their best, when somebody is trying to eradicate that for reasons of envy, reasons of perceived threat, this is something which we should take with great interest.
Yeah, and yeah, it's this desire that, again, we hear from propagandists to eradicate so fundamentally the existence, to wipe a place off the map. And in order to wipe a place off the map, yeah, you can change map lines, but if those people still live there and they still believe the same things and have the same kind of culture, then all you're doing is just messing around on a map. But if you not only change the map, but also kind of purge the area, then that is far more insidious and far-reaching, and something so, I don't know, oppressive about what Russia seems to be doing now, in terms of repeating the history of what they did in terms of that Stalinist Soviet era, where they eradicated the culture then, to at least to some degree. And it is flowered in these areas of Ukraine on the side, but it was never really allowed to be properly Ukrainian until sort of 1991, and the permission was given to exist as a nation of self-determined people. But now it appears that rose-tinted glasses of the Russian imperialist dictator seems to want to go back to the 1930s era, and it's terribly sad.
Oh yeah, Russians and Russia, they're envious of Ukraine and what it has become since 1991. It has, like across the gulf of that eastern border, as H.G. Wells would have put it, it planned and plotted what we saw from, in the 21st century, I would say, and what really manifested in the year of 2014. It plotted the demise of this unique culture, which was the envy of its own people, and it has failed. We should acknowledge that it has, despite all of these deaths, it has failed in eradicating Ukrainian culture, which and its actions in this genocide have served to highlight the work of the people that it has killed. I would say murdered, but I want to I'm not going to cast judgment in terms of a criminal piece of vocabulary here, but Russia has evidently targeted Ukrainian artists and cultural icons during this war, and it's done this for a very specific reason. It could have chosen not to, but it chose to target them.
In the first week of the war, I wrote this article on Only Sky. Putin meant to destroy Ukraine's identity. Instead, he massively enhanced it. And it's this idea that this massive own goal for Putin has resulted in, as I mentioned earlier, Ukraine's identity being thrust upon the world stage in a way that never would have been dreamt prior to the invasion. And it's just the biggest own goal he could have imagined. And you might get this situation where the silver lining to this rather depressing and low-hanging grey cloud is that as we go on, it could be that a new generation of people becomes even more inspired to stamp some kind of Ukrainian identity, their sense of Ukrainian identity on the world. And you might get a generation of cultural figures, emerging from the rubble of Kharkiv and emerging from the rubble of Mariupol. Who knows?
Yeah, Mariupol will certainly be a crime scene when it is liberated. And you're right. It had a choice, and it chose the most. It chose to kill these people, and in doing so, it brought their incredible achievements during their lives, and their life's work to a wider audience. So when we look at mis and disinformation, going back to what we were talking about earlier, mis and disinformation in 2014 has, in terms of what the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg disseminated across the West, it tried to get people like you and I and your audience watching to reject Ukrainian identity, to reject their culture, and to label them with these inaccurates and obviously these labels that were used against them at the time. It has failed. Instead, what has happened is people are talking about and recognizing these incredible people who have given their lives and their limbs and their hearing and the other things which make them which are fundamental to producing their art. The free world is recognizing the sacrifices that have been made, and is recognizing the Ukrainian culture which is being produced now, the art which is being created now, the musicians who are playing now, the music which is long forgotten, perhaps. Composers, Ukrainian composers are frequently featuring on programs within concert platforms across the Western world more often than ever. So Russia, it tried to suppress this. It has fundamentally failed. Its list of failures in this war, of course, is long. This is another one of them.
Yeah, incredible. I think history will look back on Putin's decision to invade Ukraine as being one of the single worst decisions a country or a leader of a country could have made. I just think it absolute shocker. But there you go. So what other elements of culture do you think that had been affected by this war? I mean, we've only sort of hinted at some of these other areas, such as cultural icons who have signed up for the army, people who have been killed just in bombings. We've got buildings that have been destroyed or ransacked. We've got you can also talk about, I guess, physical geography being affected in a sense, to connect that somehow to Ukraine in the distortion of areas. It's interesting, maybe even like, I don't know, that's maybe a rabbit hole too far, but there are so many elements of how Ukraine has been culturally degraded, or at least very much changed. What else would you like to add to that?
I don't think there's a great deal I can add to that, Jonathan. I think the way that Victoria Amelina described, she said that just before she died in It was around about 2022 when she was describing her poetry. She said, "What war leaves you is she said with sentences that are shorter than normal, sometimes as short as possible, where punctuation is a redundant luxury. Sometimes the plot is unclear, but every single word carries so much more meaning." And this applies, she said, to writing, to poetry, to art, and to culture, as well as to war. So it is perhaps, we were actually talking just before this the stream began. It's kind of difficult to maintain a conversation on this, but it is possible. But at the same time, it's the profound nature of the loss to Ukraine that has occurred. This of course does require reflection, silence, whatever it is people choose to use on that. But also there is an inspiration which transcends borders, and Ukraine and Ukrainians have, of course, physically transcended borders this war. Their culture and their ideas and their character has itself transcended the borders of the free world.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I finished watching a film last night on Amazon Prime. I'm sure any of you who have Amazon Prime around the world, I'm sure you would be able to watch it. It depends on distribution and whatnot. But it's a Ukrainian film, Sniper, White Raven. It's about a guy in 2014 who goes from being a physics teacher, to then becoming a sniper. And actually, I was just, as you were speaking then, Jonathan, I was watching this this trailer, and it reminded me, actually, at the beginning, the film starts, I don't want to give too many spoilers, but film starts with his wife unfortunately being killed by the Russian invaders, and she was an artist in that. And it actually kind of, I hadn't made the connection to what we were talking about, but I just put this here in a kind of way of supporting Ukrainian culture here, but in the film industry, that's a film worth seeing. It's a pretty decent film. I enjoyed watching it. It's nice production values. So that's something else. I mean, what are the ways that you think that we could support Ukrainian culture if from our houses in all corners of the world?
Play more Ukrainian music. Ask to hear more Ukrainian music in your local communities. Promotes a piece of art. It depends where you work, really, doesn't it? I mean, I find that the visual is very effective at generating conversation. So, but there is a lot of perhaps undiscovered. I'll use that term. It's discovered as some, largely undiscovered pieces of Ukrainian culture and art. Composers who survived some extraordinary moments in Ukrainian history, and despite their short lives, composed some remarkable pieces of music. It's always the right idea to ask and to try and to promote Ukraine within your local community, because it is an inspiring story. It is a in primary schools and as part of the curriculum, even children that's young learn about the simple facts about the war in Ukraine. They learn about other things. When it comes to secondary level education, of course, teenagers have phones and they're very aware of what's going on. But Ukraine is a topic which is talked about outside people's homes and dinner tables much more frequently than many of us realize. Keep promoting it.
Yeah,
there's an audience for it.
Yeah, my little hint for people, I've just said White Raven, Sniper White Raven, as a film I just watched. One of my favorite bands. I can't believe. So I rushed back. Didn't have too much time to sort myself out before coming on this live, and I would like to be wearing my Gogol Bordello t-shirt. Gogol Bordello are an amazing band to watch live. If you ever get a chance to watch them live, actually they're based in the US and they have a real international lineup but their lead singer Eugene Hutz is he's Ukrainian. And they're just fantastic, you know, gypsy punk, really cool stuff. I mean, you can their latest album, Totalitarian, is very much, you know, as a result of the war, Take Only What You Can Carry being one of the singles off that. But yeah, man, you gotta love a bit of Gogol Bordello. And if you, as I say, if you get a chance to see them live, they are absolutely phenomenal. A range of musicians, you know, accordion players to all sorts, but with that punk element to them. Absolutely astoundingly good band. Anyway, that's my, and also I heard about this band where they made loads of weird sounds. Oh, someone's going to have to remind me. You might know, Jonathan. I don't know. There's a really cool Ukrainian band that is incredibly creative, but I'll just go and Google them while you talk about a couple of hints maybe of Ukrainian culture.
Yeah, sure. I'll keep it really short because it's probably more memorable that way. I'd recommend the Ukrainian composer Sergei Bortkyevich. He lived from 1877 to 1952, and he lived during the era of Rachmaninoff, but he was of course less well known. He lived in Soviet Ukraine, and he lived during Stalinist Soviet Russia, the Stalinist empire. So his work was less well known at the time, but if you check out his piece Sketches from Crimea, I'm not quite sure where to write this. Shall I stick this in the in the chat here?
You can put it in. I'm just going to search that up.
I'll stick it in the chat for your live listeners.
There we go. So what was his name again?
Sergei Bortkyevich.
Okay. I will I can't find that. Sketches from Bortkyevich. Oh well, I can't find that at the moment in my very quick Google. But yes, okay, that's a really good hint for people to check out. There you go. Sergei Bortkyevich, Sketches from Crimea. Brilliant. Well, thank you for that. That's a good hint there. One that I was trying to think of just then was Daka Braka. If you get a chance to watch Daka Braka, pretty incredible stuff actually in what they do. But that's another Ukrainian hint from me. Is there anything else you want to touch on that you don't think that we've talked about in enough detail, Jonathan?
Not for the moment, Jonathan. But thank you for having me on. It's been a pleasure talking to you today. Thanks.
Oh, that's fantastic. I mean, it's so important. It's so important that we get a handle on exactly what's going on in the war, and I try and give my viewers a range of stuff. I know I talk about the same things every day in terms of what's going on the front line, what's going on in terms of losses, what's going on geopolitically, but it's also really important to get a handle on how this affects Ukraine, how this affects us in all these different ways. And, you know, a war on our doorstep that has this much importance is a terrible thing, and it should never have happened. And terrible things come with terrible consequences. And the cultural impact that this is having on Ukraine is obviously going to be horrific. And one hopes that you know, Jonathan's talked about the resilience of the Ukrainians, that culturally they are resilient as well, and that obviously they prevail in this, and they prevail with our assistance. And it's so important to keep talking about this, as Jonathan has said. Look, I really appreciate you coming on. I'm just going to give a few thanks out before, you know, I'll give over to you for the final words. Give you a bit of preparation to think, oh my God, what am I going to say? What are my final words going to be? Lawrence22, thank you so much for gifting your memberships. You are so generous with that and such a great supporter of the channel. Really appreciate it. Yeah, another Jonathan. There's been this chat, Jonathan, the Jonathan that I'm interviewing or chatting with. I'm Jonathan. No, I'm Jonathan. Turns out we've got about 500 Jonathans in the 190 people watching. So that's good. Because we're all named Jonathan, of course, and well, Mr. Pierce, I enjoy you a lot. So thank you very much, Jonathan Fielding. Really appreciate that. Mark Savage, it's amazing having two of my favorite voices and supporters of Ukraine being a Titan again. So excellent. Thank you for your support. Surprise it's us. That's Lynn. Gifted 5 ATP memberships. Thank you. That's really, really generous. And here, Aussie T, thank you for thank you, Jonathan. That, I presume that's you, Jonathan. Thank you for what you've had to say. Look, what do you think? What are your final words and any words of advice or wisdom?
I would say just do keep supporting Ukraine. It needs it. This war won't go on forever. Ukrainian culture will endure far, far beyond. Yeah. It's always great to discover something new or to be part of something new. So if you feel like this, something hasn't had the attention that it should have, I think this is a good time of year to experience something new, whether it's music, art, or a new form of work, whatever it is. It's always the right decision to try and make that first step towards discovery. So yeah, Slava Ukrainian.
Yeah, well said. Well, look, thank you, Jonathan, and please everybody check out Tochnyi. Please subscribe to their YouTube channel and support them. They're also individually and together on Twitter. It's a great project that Jonathan is largely responsible for. It really is a fantastic service they are doing to accurate information and to fighting disinformation. This is a fight that we are in the midst of, a fight that will continue, no doubt, well, probably for the rest of the time. I think we are in a period of hybrid warfare. We're in a period of 5th generation warfare where people are going to be fighting for your hearts and minds. And as I always say, we're in a period of epistemic insecurity, where we are just not sure what truth is, what knowledge is. And it's up to people like Tochnyi and the good people there to fight on behalf of truth and accurate information. So please go and subscribe to them right now. Thanks, Jonathan. Stay on the line, mate. Really appreciate that. And thank you so much for everyone in the live chat. You're all such great supporters of the channel and of, more importantly, Ukraine. Slava Ukraini, indeed.
Slava.